The video you watched is tremendous in terms of what HCEF does in partnership with others to help community to build the skills, the resources, and anything obviously you can contribute will be greatly appreciated. An important role is played by no other than women, than young, old alike. And in this panel, empowering women is empowering a whole society. It is truly that. And I encourage all of you, men and women, to participate. And during the Q&A, please, I ask the young women to stand up and ask questions as well and be informed and inform us as well. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Malak Khader. Malak Khader is a student of public affairs and political science at Marshall University. She is a student activist and advocate of diversity. Malak is renowned in her community and West Virginia for her eloquent representation of Arab Americans. She is also an exemplary alumna of HCEF Know Thy Heritage Leadership Program. Malak, welcome.
Good afternoon. That was a very flattering introduction. Thank you. Today we have two incredible women with us, Mrs. Hanan Munayyer and Dr. Abir Kayed Pilon. Mrs. Hanan Munayyer is a Palestinian American from Haifa and is the president and co-founder of the Palestinian Heritage Foundation that promotes awareness and understanding of Palestinian art and culture and Arabs in general. Mrs. Munayyer received her MS from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and immigrated with her husband in 1970 to the United States, where she worked as a pharmaceutical researcher for 33 years before establishing the Palestinian Heritage Foundation. As an expert in Palestinian and Arab traditional dress, she designs and curates museum exhibits, lectures nationally, co-produced and wrote The Palestinian Costumes and Embroidery, A Precious Legacy, which is a documentary used extensively by education institutions. Her 2011 book, entitled Traditional Palestinian Costumes, Origins and Evolution, received the Book of the Year Award in the Art from the Forward Review. Mrs. Munayyer is a member of the New Jersey Arab American Heritage Commission, a state entity appointed by the New Jersey governor. We also have Dr. Abir Kayed Pilon. She is an American French-Palestinian professor of political science and history at the University of the District of Columbia and Montgomery College. Dr. Pilon was born in Shatila, is in a Shatila camp in Beirut from Palestine, and her parents were born in Haifa. After the Israeli invasion of Beirut in 1982, she moved to Saudi Arabia and from there to Paris in 1994 to study political science. She holds a PhD in political science from the Université de Paris. Dr. Pilon is a longtime activist, beginning from her days as the vice president of the General Union of Palestinian Students in Paris. She appeared on Al Jazeera, Russian TV, and numerous other radio stations, in addition to participating in many cultural and political events in the US, France, Germany, and Belgium. She is a published writer and poet whose first book was published earlier this year entitled The Ongoing Nakba, 65 Years of Fragmentations, that chronicles the history of Palestinian struggles since 1948 through poetry. She also published numerous articles in French, Arabic, and English, along with researching politics, women issues, and education. Both Dr. Pilon and Mrs. Munayyer are exemplary women in their fields, exhibiting the diversity and accomplishments of Palestinian women. Please welcome them.
Hello, can you hear me well? Okay. No? I have a weak voice. Okay, this is better. We're going to do about 10 minutes, a very short introduction, not my usual lecture. This is simply to put things in context, and Abir is going to do another 10 minutes, and we would like to encourage you. We left time for questions and answers. We'd very much like to get input from you. And maybe we could put out a few questions for the audience that they might think of a future project. I'm going to hit mostly on the previous history of Palestinian women, and Abir will maybe deal with a more modern version of what's happening these days. But throughout history, and especially the last 2 centuries of recorded history, Palestinian women have had a very central role in the Palestinian family. The mother, being the center of the family, has had big influence, and although you might read in reports about the patriarchal society, from my personal experience, I think it is a very matriarchal society masquerading as a patriarchal society, because the women, especially as they get older in age, really control most of what's happening around the house, and the children and the upbringing, and that includes preserving the tradition. So preserving traditions is what I've concentrated on a lot in the last 20 years of research. It started with the collection of costumes, but it's really spread to where I educated myself on all that was happening in Palestine. So it was the economical and the historical picture that were included. The woman in the house was not only the preserver of tradition and the costumes and the embroideries and the patterns and the tradition of her mother and grandmother, and the cuisine, the recipes, the songs that were sung at the wedding, the songs that were sung in happy and sad occasions. She was also a very important historian of what was happening without her knowing, because what happened in this present age, where you will see, I'll give you just snippets later on, is what the Palestinian dress is. It's really a form of archaeological data, because the way it is cut, its history, and what I found out in museum information all over the world, European and American textile museums, is that the cut of the dress is ancient. The patterns, some of them go to BC. The embroidery started in the Middle East around the 8th century, so that the embroidery was well formed with cross-stitch, everything you see nowadays, from around the 9th to 10th century, before the Crusades, before the Ottoman rule, before anything European influenced it. And on top of all that, these patterns, because we lived in the Holy Land, a lot of pilgrims came, took souvenirs back to Europe, and the patterns and embroidery of Palestine were spread all over Europe, and that is well documented in the book with references for whoever finds it a little bit hard to understand. There's a book outside. You're welcome to leaf through and get references, especially for the students. And here, there is a lot of material that's covered in the book, but a lot of material needs to be covered in the future. And I'm hoping the young generation of students might maybe want to do a thesis study on one of the many angles of that history. The strong personality of the Palestinian woman has always been clear to whoever lived in Palestine. In the older times, before 1948, the village women were very involved in the planting, the agricultural life of the city. In the towns and the cities, the women was more indoors. They might have had a workshop of embroidery or a similar kind of indoor cottage industry. So what they did, basically preserving that tradition, preserved a whole industry. In Palestine, the fabric that was used for traditional dress was woven locally. Mejdal, Gaza, Bethlehem, Nablus were big centers of textile weaving, and they wove specifically for the local market. So the traditional dress was establishing and helping preserve a local industry. When the European fabrics started coming in the late 19th century, the Syrian textile industry was hit hard, because it was a big industry that exported all over the Middle East, whereas Palestinian textile industry was not, because tradition decreed that exact fabric that was only available from local industry. So she has had the woman has had a big impact unknowingly on establishing and continuing economic ties. Well, at present, what happened in 1948 was a catastrophe, as we all know, and the big change was everybody that became a refugee initially had a hard time, and Abir will hit on it more, but what happened also is a lot of those dresses either were lost or were later on being sold to get very important economic assistance to the family. And this is where a lot of the collections of Palestinian dresses came from. Every time there was a war, 1948, 67, and later on, there was a wave of traditional dresses on the market and antique dealers. And that's how it was preserved, and museums all over Europe and the United States have collections of them. Our collection is huge, and if anybody's interested to read about it, there is a brochure about it, over 3,000 items of art included. How's my time? I think I'm gonna leave a little bit of time, but what's very important now, also in the collections, also in preserving the heritage, is who is collecting these my husband and I are a team, but there are many other women collectors, like Widad Qawar in Amman. She's from Bethlehem. She is one of the best and earliest collectors. There are many women who have done preserving and collecting. Other women like May Ali is a college professor who has done documenting of history. She wrote a book about Haifa. There are many other such women who are basically trying to document whatever was almost lost, like the songs that were sung at weddings. I would like to show you, since a lot of the young people here might not have seen embroidery of Palestine, the older people I'm sure are familiar, just to give you a visual effect of what it is. Here are old pictures from the National Geographic magazine from 1920s of a Jerusalem woman. This is the real thing. She's wearing the headdress, and so you see a very ornate headdress and very beautifully embroidered dress. Here is the Ramallah lady from the same era, wearing that same ancient headdress that dates back to pre-Roman times in the Middle East, and it's also featured in all Byzantine icons up to the present day, a very old style. Here is the Bethlehem bride from the 19th century, wearing, again, every region had its very specific style, so that you can easily identify which dress and which headdress comes from where in Palestine in the 19th and early 20th century. And here is that headdress that dates back to the 2nd century in Tadmor, Palmyra. And in Ugarit, there is a tiny statue discovered from 1200 BC. And here is the full beauty of the Melek bridal dress worn by a young lady that we do a lot with these days, photography, using, I like to use Palestinian women, and sometimes choosing even the same town. This is a lady who's Handal, Michelle Handal, from obviously Bethlehem, who's modeling the Bethlehem costume from the 19th century. And here is another young lady from the Ramallah area, modeling they're all college graduates, very highly educated women, modeling the Ramallah outfit from the 19th century. And here is our oldest daughter, who's a lawyer, mother of two, modeling the El Khalil bridal costume. And our youngest daughter modeling Nablus area. Nablus didn't have a lot of embroidery, but had very colorful costumes. And here are the young ladies who are now working all over the Middle East. This is a picture taken in Shatila from the workshops that are, this is a very important economic source of income for young women who are in refugee camps. Mothers have a few kids in the house, cannot leave, cannot have jobs, and jobs are restricted to begin with. So the cottage industry of embroidery is very important, with a network internationally in Europe, United States, that sells through volunteer work their work and sends back the money. And I'm sure you've seen that work in Washington, D.C., events all over on tables. So here are the young women working at home while their kids are playing around. We took that picture from their workshop. It was a very emotional experience. We went there into the nursery school, and they had little kids. The teacher told them, stand up and tell the visitors where you come from. And so this little girl and little boy stand up and tell you the name of the village that they came from in Palestine. They were refugees from the Galilee, and this is where I came from, and I had goosebumps. It was one of the most emotional experiences. They had kept preserved all their memories. And here are the workshops all over. This is from a workshop in Beirut that does, Palestinian workshop, does beautiful, high-quality luxury items, pillows on silk, embroidered and then beaded. And a lot of the products are sold all over the world, and the ladies from the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf love to buy the very expensive coats and jackets, all embroidered with beads. And the history of the Palestinian dress goes very, very ancient. This is a 19th century Palestinian dress, very similar to a 7th century dress, 7th century to the 20th century. And here is a piece of embroidery from Oxford Museum of Embroidery in Egypt, and that was the same kind of embroidery in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, all that area, of cross-stitch embroidery on linen, exactly like Palestinian dresses, silk thread, exactly, and the colors and the patterns are identical to Palestinian embroidery. And here is the couching stitch embroidery, very similar to the Bethlehem style embroidery, again from the 12th century, 13th century in the Arab world. The patterns are ancient. The headdress is ancient. The dresses, Melek dress from Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Jaffa. This is from the Galilee, very unknown because it disappeared about 50 years earlier than the rest. Beautiful silk fabric, silk embroidery. Very modern, I think, in its look. And that's it. I'll just, if you want more information. If there are any questions, please, we're going to do questions, and then Abir will do questions too. Or you can think about it also, combine the questions later. Yeah. Oh, I see. All right.
Hello, is it on? Hello? Oh, okay. So my name is Naya. My question is, the Palestinian embroidery is something that we can say is based to Palestine, but has anyone tried to take it and interpret it into a brand? So for instance, someone can identify with the embroidery, but they specialize in a certain silhouette or a new shape, and it's kind of reinterpreting the concept into more mass production and creating something that can then be outsourced or exported to others.
You sound like my two daughters who are in advertising brand, you know. Okay, actually what has been done by the workshops is exactly that. There's workshops, several of them in Lebanon, many more in all over the Arab world, Syria, Jordan, of course in Palestine. Embroidery is very expensive to do, and the workshops have found out that it's just not a very easy income producing. So the old pillows that had huge embroidery were barely covering their expenses plus, and it generated, because of volunteer work, it produced some kind of small. What the workshops are doing now is, and I tried to work with them, for example, to tell them what an Arab American lady or American lady would like to buy here is, for example, an evening jacket that she can wear over a modern dress, etc. So we worked with each other quite a bit. My husband has worked with them in producing very beautiful, large wall hangings to decorate the house. They're inspired by the headscarves, but now they produce a decorative element. So there is a lot of that going, to the point where I've tried talking to them to avoid the total modernization where you almost lose the traditional Palestinian. It's not enough to put a little bit of a hatta fabric to call this Palestinian. You have to preserve the patterns that have been preserved for so long that are really the identity of Palestinian embroidery. Because you don't have the fabrics anymore, you don't have the style, it's changed. And I'm trying to introduce any lady who wears the hijab to introduce some embroidery in her. Because twice in lectures, professors men stood up and told me, why don't the modern hijab ladies include some embroidery? It was the men who were asking for it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Elena Farsach, and I want to say how much I really enjoyed your lecture, although brief. It was really informative, and thank you. I wanted to say, I guess I don't really have a well-formed question, but there was an exhibit I saw in New York some time ago, maybe 10 years ago, and it was discussing chivalry, the origins of chivalry and the knights and everything. And of course, we know, most people here know the story of the Crusades and, you know, the plunder that was involved and everything, and how many things were brought back culturally. You mentioned that about the embroidery going back to Europe. And I was wondering what can be done, because obviously people here and in Europe have such a passion and fantasies about knights and, you know, ladies' fair and all that kind of stuff, to get them to understand that a lot of those things, not just the embroidery, but the way courtly love, the way people, knights behave towards women and that sort of thing, that a lot of that came from the Arabs. And I think embroidery is a nice way to get that notion launched, and to have people actually talk about that here, and how much we, the Arabs, have influenced a lot of the beauty of what's considered to be European.
You've hit on my favorite topic these days, because after doing all the research and going on not only embroidery, I covered, there's a book about the age of chivalry and heraldry that actually was an Arab tradition that was carried into from the Crusade time into Europe. So it's not only that, it's the architecture in Europe, it's so many other things that have been screaming Arab heritage in Europe that is totally slided on and called Romanesque, which is, it has absolutely nothing to do with the Roman architecture. It is really inspired by Al-Andalus architecture in Spain and Italy. And then we just visited Italy this last summer and had a course in a Georgetown Villa there, and they talked about all the arts of Florence, never once mentioning the tradition that was inspired by Spain and the Arab world. So what I plan to do, as long as I can do that, is put down that material. We've done panels and conferences that I've talked on that, but I would like to do a small book that brings in that information that can be used in schools and maybe on internet where teachers can download the material easily and translate it into Arabic, because I think the Arab world needs to know its legacy even more than here. All my information was taken from Western sources, and the academics in Western sources know and have written about it for a long time. It's the Arabs who don't know enough about it. So that book needs to be done in English and in Arabic for schools.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Just briefly, we heard earlier today about obstacles to trade in Palestine, and could you talk a little bit about how the raw materials for the textiles are sourced? Are they produced indigenously from the produce of the land, or does a lot have to be imported? And then a second question, what can organizations like HCEF and ANERA and some of these other NGOs do to support the embroidery industry? Is it something like rehabilitation of the workshop space, or what other assistance would be helpful? And then finally, what can we do here in the US to promote this industry? Our church has done Holy Land sales, and I think from us, we'd love to have more of the embroidery products available. Everyone's very familiar with olive wood from Palestine, but this would be a marvelous addition as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, you have a loaded question there, several. The resources that are used, there's resource problems in Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank, there's resource problems in the Arab world. Basically, what we used to do all the time was, up till about 10 years ago in Jerusalem, they would get big bales of the fabric that was being woven in Gaza by the old Gaza weavers, basically the Al-Majd weavers, a very old tradition. very little machine work, basically. They call it machine, but it's really hand-generated machine, basically. This stopped about 10 years ago. There are no more fabrics being done, with the horrible conditions in Gaza. Also, in Jerusalem, they used to get some from Ramallah. Ramallah machine woven. It has to be woven in a specific weave to be able to be used for cross-stitch embroidery. Again, I've gone searching for this fabric, begging for little bits of it, and it's just not available. So if you can encourage a kind of workshop of weaving that would generate that back, that's what I've been trying to encourage people. In Jordan, they have started to do that. The king and his father used to generate special art and crafts projects, but we need more of it. So embroidery fabric is not local. The thread is imported. It used to be imported from France, the DMC, good quality. Now it's being imported from Korea and China, and the quality is not always as required. In Lebanon, it's not just the materials. We wanted to do a large piece, and we had to send them the linen from here to guarantee that they find linen. They couldn't even find linen to do that. What the problem was is the organizer of the workshop is in Beirut, in the Shatila camp, but the ladies who do the embroidery are in the camps Ain al-Hilwi and in the south, which were not available for usual, the ladies couldn't move back and forth. So this one sole lady who had the permission to get to that area would have to bring the materials to them, then go back and get the materials back. So any project we work with them, you have to plan on 6 months to a year for it to be finished. There were several high-quality designers from France and the United States who came to our house wanting to partner with embroidery workshops so that they could introduce Palestinian embroidery into their couture. We tried hard, the workshops tried hard, but you cannot generate in time for somebody with a strict designer timeline. So there are a lot of attempts being done, but there needs to be a lot more of the lesser effect and higher price. Maybe pillows that are not all fully embroidered, that are small piece of embroidery but very artfully decorated with fabric around it. That kind of idea. Maybe jeans with just one pocket of embroidery. Maybe a vest of jeans fabric with one pocket of embroidery. That's the kind of thing that we need to think on for generation of income for very needy families.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to Dr. Pinel now. If you guys have any more questions for Mrs. Menayir, I ask that you please save it till the end of the presentation.
Hello, do you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abir. As she mentioned, I was born in a Palestinian camp in Beirut. And my parents both were born in Haifa, Palestine, before 1948. So the common thing that I just discovered with Hanan yesterday, that she was born in Haifa like my parents. But I was born in Beirut. I am like any refugees, Palestinian refugee, born, raised amongst many continents, not only countries. So I was raised in Saudi Arabia, and then I couldn't, of course, attend the university because, first of all, as a woman, you can't study political science. And the second, that we were treated as foreigners. So I moved to France. I studied political science, and I think she has said a lot about my activities. It's been like 20 years. I'm a Palestinian activist for right of return. As a third Palestinian generation, I will just give a definition. What is Palestinian are? Palestinian are a people, history, heritage. As you can see, we have many parts in our life, in our history that shows that we are people. We are not today, like a lot of media show, like Palestinians are violent and Palestine becomes already Ramallah and Gaza. So we are trying, by empowering a lot of women, to point out one important thing in our daily life as a Palestinian, that our identity is very important for us, so that's why we keep up with a lot of work. So I'll start by by saying for the women's, 2/3 of 774 percent of worldwide women are illiterate. And how about Palestinians? I will talk before 1948, a lot of Palestinian women were not educated due to the, of course, culture, history, and basic tradition that a lot of Palestinians got married between the age 14 years old. My mom, by the way, was married when she was, don't be shocked, 15 years old, and my dad was 19 years old. So that's an example. And we are 9 kids, so they didn't have Facebook and Google. They were sleeping at 7 a.m. and then that's it. But our generation is different. So a lot of women were really taking care of kids, staying at home, and just cooking or working the fields with olives, zayt al-zaytun. All of us know about it. And we're really not participating in the daily life. But women really get more and more and more strong after 1948 because we just become a victim of the new state of Israel that's established and, of course, driven a lot of Palestinians out. And that will, of course, push a lot of Palestinian women, including my mom as a journalist, she's now retired, and myself, to keep up with our history. That what we preserve, and we are very, very proud to be Palestinians, diaspora or inside or outside Palestine. So we really keep up with this identity, and that's why I moved, for example, to United States of America in 2006, just to educate Americans about Palestinians. And of course, I think you can see a lot of students here. Raise your hand. So all of them, I think, I want to tell you a secret, maybe I hide it. The first class, I don't say I am a Palestinian. I want you to discover why. Did I say, guys? No, I did not. The stereotype about Palestinians already by itself is an obstacle for Palestinians. So you start, of course, all of us Palestinian, English is not my first language. We have accent, and we are proud of this accent. So I start educating them, teaching history or politics, and they will discover little by little that their professor, maybe she has an accent, she has a different background and visions and ideology, and she's trying not to convince them, but to put facts. So a lot of Americans will understand the truth about Palestine. It's not just, having a bias about the Palestinians or the history of Palestinians people. And that's why I think education is very important for us, and that's why I thank you very much, guys, for coming, and I thank Ratib Rabia for giving this a scholarship for the students. And as a woman, after we go back to after 1948, so women were really engaged in politics and in activities and in preparing the whole family to just keep up with the consequences of the Nakba. And I will immediately say what's the Nakba. It's the catastrophe that Hanan mentioned. I just published this book called The Ongoing Nakba, النكبة المستمرة 65 عاما من التشرذم أين فلسطين, means 65 years of fragmentations, where's Palestine? It's just empowering already myself and my generations to keep up with our history and to know exactly what happened in 1948 and to take a lesson and then to educate others who are not, because this book will be translated into English and French and Hebrew. So others who trying to create a different history, different destiny about Palestinian, to tell them no. We are a people, we have heritage, we were there 7,500 years before many different people were. And I'll talk about after 1948, of course, pushed a lot of Palestinians to live in Lebanon, Syria, as myself. So with those Palestinians, how they lived? They survived like any people. I remember my grandfather saying, like, we don't have country, ma'annash balad, then you have to study. And he was the mayor of Haifa. So if we don't have a country, then what you have to do is get diploma. That's what we have to compensate, to replace or looking for alternative, status for our life. And that's why a lot of Palestinians after 1948 will be, a lot of us are very and highly educated. And I can mention a lot of names, but like Hanan Ashrawi, and many poets and many historians and many Palestinian that maybe you don't know, but I don't want to mention their names. They work nowadays in the State Department, that I know them, Pentagon, and they are Arab Americans, Palestinian American, whatever they call them, but also contribute to our daily life in politics as Arab Americans. Our generations with each war that gave us just more hope and passion about Palestine. We never forgot who we are. Maybe certain Israeli challenged us, saying that the third generation will forget. Remind me, the first will die, or the first will die, and the second will forget. This is what the Golda Meir says, long time. So the first died. My grandfather passed away, but and my father's still alive, but we didn't forget. We just challenged that, and we still keeping up, and we said, the first thing we said when we meet people, I am from Haifa. Nowadays, Haifa is Israel. Yes, that's right. But we still refers ourselves to our cities where we come from. A lot of people in the Ain al-Hilwi or Shatila, where I was born, in Palestinian camp, refugee camps, you don't even hear them speaking the Lebanese accent. We even keep the accent of its villages. That my dad still, right now, he's from Tirat Haifa. It's a very small village in Haifa, so that we still keeping the qaf, the kaf, all the accents, like New York's and Boston and different states here in the United States. I will talk also about how education has a change for Palestinian women. Education becomes the first step for Palestinians to exist everywhere. A lot of media, US media, try to describe Palestinian that a lot of them veiled, covered, yes, you can see that, and dirt, and kids are running after the tanks and throwing stones. This is not the image of Palestinians. Palestinians are, a lot of them, well-educated. Palestinian women now takes a lot of places and different institutions, are educators, doctors, engineers, everywhere. You can notice that. I'm still good in time? Okay. Also, I will talk about after 1967. Each time after any war, the 1967 also pushed a lot of Palestinians to move to Jordan and Syria and what we called it, in different places that Palestinians live in. Those Palestinians did not really forget who they are till now, and they still keep up with education, and they still come here to the United States to study, or in France like myself or others in Britain, and they continue just to empower themselves and continue, like Hanan and I, keep up and tell more stories about heritage. So we really, until this time, we did not deny that we suffered. We had a war. We had to go through a lot of, myself, I lived 1982 war under the Israeli occupation in Beirut, and we know what the F-16, but we still very determined that our real weapons is education. So that's why we said education is the key of our society for Palestinians, or for any society of the world. Because if we are educated, so we know how to get our right back, and we know how to negotiate with our occupiers. Until right now, of course, education is so hard for certain Palestinians in the Palestinian territories. Have you seen, I think you have seen already a lot of these shows and documentary that says it's not easy. So I really appreciate the Holy Land work, but we really need a lot of support from Americans and from others who can really enhance and also help Palestinians to get better life and to be educated like any nation. So I thank you very much and wait your question. Running on time.
If I may, before the questions, if I could just add a little bit. Abir mentioned that her mother was wed at 15. In that generation, a lot of women were wed at 13 to 15. And I thought that was a factor of Palestinian life. And then I was reading about European history, and actually there was a beautiful Italian bestseller book that mentions this lady from the 17th century Italy who was married at 13. And it turns out that all over Europe also, girls were being married up to 15 years. And the question is why? And the answer is really very simple. Before antibiotics, the age expectancy for most women was in the 40s. So she had to get married, have kids, and bring them up before life, so there is, it's not a Middle Eastern aspect. It's really all over the world. Women would get married really young.
Yeah, before the contraception pills by Margaret, I think my U.S. history class, they know what I'm talking about. Yeah, who invented the pills, and of course.
The other point I want to make was we talked here quite a bit in the conference about Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian. If you notice, I didn't mention anything about different embroidery, and that was really for one simple reason. In Palestine, say take Bethlehem, the traditional dress and the costume was exactly alike and there are documentation and photographs in National Geographic magazine of the majority who were Christian at that point and the minority who were Muslim, and they were exactly alike. The same accent, the same costume, the same cuisine at home, the same habits in general. And that holds true. Several examples I can give you all over Palestine. What was important was the regional identity, not the religious identity. And that, I think, is a factor of the fact that when Islam came to Palestine, it was a majority of Christians. And it took, according to Philip Hetty, about 200 years of a slow conversion to produce a majority of Muslims. So that most of the Muslims in Palestine were originally from the Christian, who were originally from the Canaanite pagan. So the Palestinian Arab nowadays is really a descendant of very old line of people that had never mass emigrated out of the country, except till the 1948 catastrophe.
We can open the floor to questions now for either of our panelists.
For Dr. Abid. You mentioned that post-1948 role of women changed a lot. Could you draw a distinction between the role in the private and public spheres and how those changed from before 1948 to post-1948?
Okay, before 1948, we didn't have occupation. So Palestine was Palestine, and Palestinians live, Christian, Muslims, and Jews. We had 2% of the population were Jews. So the women were really living in a peaceful life, and they didn't have a struggle to go through walls nowadays, for example, or through checkpoints. So they were having a peaceful life, and they were getting married early, and of course because of the traditions of the Middle East, so a lot of them were really not well educated, like they don't go to school because certain habits or certain traditions prevented them. But after 1948, they had to face refugee camps, like my mom living in refugee camps, struggle. They have to learn many languages to communicate with people. I remember in 1982, for example, I thought that my grandfather used to speak Hebrew and Turkish and also Arabic, beside, of course, English, because we have the British for 33 years of mandate. So I thought that my mom didn't speak any English. I discovered that my mom was learning by herself, so we can ask for a lot of those nonprofit organizations who came to Beirut to secure Palestinians and help them. They were all of them learning by themselves. So my mom, as a woman, she's not educated. She even just till maybe when she was 10 years old, she stopped her school. But she was so passionate about Palestine, because when you lose your land, you lose your identity. So to keep up with, they have to create their own world of education. It's not going to school, it's not having diploma, but educate themselves about languages, about how to write articles, how to report. And she never been, in a school to study journalism, but she becomes from one of the top An-Nahar. I don't know if you know Al-Jaridat An-Nahar. It's one of the famous newspaper in Beirut. So that's an example, and of course my cousins, the whole families were really into education, or educate themselves, of course, because you don't have lands, then you have to, this alternative, or you have this struggle where creates needs to exist.
Hi, my name is Elise. I guess so. When I was watching the video before this session, I saw that the mayor of Bethlehem was a woman, and I wanted to know the current status of women in the public sphere in Palestine, but also how the different refugee settlements or the different locations in the diaspora have changed women's status after the occupation or after the war.
You will.
Okay.
I will add after her.
Okay. What was the first part of the question?
Well, the first part was the status of Palestinian women in the public space today.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, that's what it was. The mayor. Not only is the mayor of Bethlehem a woman, the mayor of Ramallah is a woman now, and they visited Washington D.C. Recently. Women, if you go to the colleges in the West Bank, and I haven't been to Gaza, but if you go to Bir Zayt, to Bethlehem universities, to Jerusalem universities, they're getting help from overseas a little bit, and they're building new campuses to be able to educate everybody who cannot travel out of the country to study, so that you're having a very large input of students from high school going into colleges locally. And if you walk around, you'll find a very nice proportion of half-half women and men. Young, it's an amazing experience to see so many young people, so hardworking, energetic, extremely tied into the internet, to the whole world, and very outspoken, very strong personalities in the women, especially now. They're coming out with high levels of degrees, professionals in all architects, all kinds of areas, and working locally, and if they emigrate, then they continue. What is diaspora doing for them? The diaspora all over is trying very much to keep in touch, like this organization, helping as much as possible. So, for example, in New Jersey, where we live now, there's like every little village has its own organization, and everyone helps their village to begin with. And then they come under the umbrella of another organization that helps, for example, all the hospitals in Jerusalem and sending medical aid, etc. There is only so much an emigrant population and diaspora can do. And that's why we always think that the best hope and the best help is from the regular American, and which is this organization is a perfect example of it. The best help has come from NGOs in Europe and the United States, church groups all over. The church groups have been really quite active in producing. When they do an orphanage, for example, it's not only for Christians. The kids in the orphanage are mixed, and with a large proportion of Muslims now, the churches are producing the education and the support for the whole population of Palestine, which I really give them a lot of credit for.
Yeah, if you would, I would maybe focus on after 2005 when Hamas was elected. The situation of a lot of women in Gaza was really, I think, hard, and still right now is hard. So there is nothing to do until everything's, I think Israel recognized the state of Palestine, and then we, demolish this wall. So that would help a lot, because right now I don't think says. The political situation also, it's by itself, it's a huge barrier for us as a nation or as a people, not only women, I'm sorry, to continue our, peaceful daily life. That's the, we cannot just, guys, deny in fact, what's going on with the wall and checkpoints. And I think if you have seen or you're not, I will encourage you to see 5 Broken Cameras documentary. It's exactly tell you what's going on the ground. It's different when we see in the media. So that helps a lot to understand the struggle of Palestinians in a daily life.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any more questions?
That's my husband, Farah Mnayer, by the way.
My niece, when we went to the Hebrew University in 1960s, in the early 60s, there were only 2 Arab students allowed into medical school. Look what's the difference today. Today, my niece is part of a group of 40 medical students at the Technion in Haifa
Yeah.
By the way, to continue in that trend, inside Israel there is a large population of Palestinians. Quarter of Israelis are Palestinian Arabs. They have one of the highest proportion of education among Palestinians, which is already much higher than a lot of the Arab world. And you go into a hospital in Haifa, for example. I was just there because an uncle was there. At least half the staff, from doctors to heads of departments to the nurses and male nurses, etc., are Arabs. It's amazing what's happening now.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question to go back to the embroidery and the dresses that you talked about earlier. So can you talk a little bit more about the significance of the headdresses and the different colors and the patterns and how that connects to the Palestinian culture?
That's usually my main focus, but this time we were asked to do more of a social aspect. Basically, after many years of research, and the book is outside as a student, if you leaf through it, you'll get beautiful ideas. The cut of the dress is of historic importance. I'm a scientist, I'm molecular biology, so I wanted only strictly facts, not folklore, which is a beautiful area of study, but I wanted to prove what I was coming up with was fact. So the cut of the dress is ancient, dates back to about the 1st or 2nd century AD, or maybe earlier. And there are pieces in museums that reflect that, and the book shows pictures of them. Then the style of the headdresses, some of them are BC, like I mentioned the Bethlehem one, and there are many statues around the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine were really one unit in history, developed together. The Levant, it was called, and they have many statues all over the Middle East that show how ancient the headdresses are. Then you come to the embroidery, the fabric itself. Textiles was a very important economic export of the whole Middle East. 80% of what was exported from Palestine in ancient antiquity up till modern times was textiles. So a very important tradition, and the embroidery on it, that was common to all the Arab world. So my research really reflects all the Arab world. You cannot take Palestine out of that picture as something different. The patterns are different of the embroidery, the style is slightly different, but the tradition of textile weaving and embroidery and the know-how and the needles needed to do that were part of what was generated in the 7th to the 9th century through Arab, for example, Arabs doing the Damascus blade and producing very fine steel, therefore they can produce steel needles that could do fine embroidery. Before that, there was no embroidery. It was decoration by brocading, weaving, tablet weaving, they call it. So there was decoration, but was not embroidery. So all of this tradition is ancient Arab from medieval times. So it's hard to find anything modern in Palestinian embroidery that was not ancient up till the 19th century, early 20th century. From that time onwards, with modern communication and transport and tourism and open borders and everything, there was a huge influx of foreign influence on Palestinian embroidery, and now it's a little bit of a soup. But if you go back, and that's why in the book I concentrated strictly on the old traditional pre-foreign influence to show what true ancient traditional Palestinian embroidery was, to prove it's a data point to study in history, just like any engraving in archaeology.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, my main question was sort of based on the ancient history of that embroidery. Did it have sort of a general meaning, for
regional?
Yeah, the certain
general
types of,
meaning, yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
what did it signify?
Every pattern in the embroidery, and that really truly amazed me, has, besides having a name used by the ladies who embroidered them, everyone had a symbol of some sort. One was the dates, for example, the palm tree, because the dates were a survival item of food when you're traveling in the desert. The S shape, which is symbolic of the leeches, which gave you lowered your blood pressure before modern medicine. So it was longevity. Everything has a happy, prosperous, or is related to the cypress tree that was very subtle in Palestine. every single one of them has a history. Many times the Palestinian women didn't know the history anymore. You had to dig into archaeology to see what it was. It was so old that it was forgotten. And then they would put new names on it, like the road to Gaza. And, you know, it wasn't the road to Gaza 200, 500 years ago.
We'll take one more question.
Hi. So being half Lebanese and half Palestinian, I hear a lot of stories on my father's side from my grandma about educational opportunities for her. She couldn't go to school when she moved from Palestine to Lebanon. And I know that there's a lot of issues with rights between how much people in Lebanon, Lebanese citizens have compared to what is afforded for Palestinian citizen or Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk about how the status is of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon now, and then also maybe how it is for women, especially because men usually take precedence for job opportunities, especially when it's limited to Palestinians in Beirut.
Okay, thank you. Well, as a Palestinian born in Lebanon, the status is very hard for many reasons. First of all, when it comes to jobs, 75 jobs are denied for Palestinians who in Lebanon. So the only thing they can do is just collecting or trash or selling vegetables or I don't know, bakery stuff, you know, or you know, really low-class job, I can call it. So what the Palestinians do, a lot of Palestinians nowadays, the statistic, official statistic of Lebanon are not really based on accurate percentage of Palestinians. Why? Because in 1982, a lot of Palestinians went to Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and immigrated. So the real numbers nowadays are saying between 750,000, which is not true at all. It's about 200,000. That's it. Yes, so we don't have Palestinians anymore like in Lebanon. A lot of camps in Lebanon, we do have certain families, but nowadays a lot of those camps habited by Syrians, refugees, and before even the Syrian refugees, we have these vague of the workers, Syrian workers, start in the 90s. And the status of women in general, well, Lebanon has a different culture than any country in the Middle East. It's more open for women, and it's like understanding more women needs. But for Palestinians, it's hard. So the only job that Palestinian women can do, whether being a school teacher, or but only in the UNRWA school, not in Lebanon school. So it's just for inside or any UNRWA inside. You know, the UNRWA, all the United Nations, services provide for Palestinians. So it's so hard. For example, I had my brother who just graduated master from American University in Beirut. He couldn't find a job, and each time they said, well, Palestinian, like a monster, you can't. So you need an internship. And even to get an internship, you can't. So it's really so hard. So a lot of Palestinians go to the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, and all this country, all to Europe. So we thank you very much for hosting us, and we thank Ratib Rabia and the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundations.
Absolutely. From both of us. Thank you.
From both of us.
Please join me to thank the panel. They have done a great job. Thank you very much. Thank you.